When we think of the Middle Ages, a certain kind of image usually comes to mind: gallant knights on horseback, towering stone castles, royal banquets under flickering candlelight, and queens in gowns that sweep across the floor. Hollywood has done a great job painting the period as romantic, noble, even magical, but for all the pageantry we associate with the medieval world, we rarely stop to ask a more grounded, more personal question: what was daily life actually like for ordinary people? Not just kings and lords, but farmers, monks, bakers, and blacksmiths. How did they live? How did they cook, sleep, and, yes, even go to the bathroom? Now, I know that might sound like a strange direction to take. It's not the usual historical tour, but stay with me. Because sometimes the most humble parts of history, the parts we often overlook, reveal the most human truths, and few things are more universal than needing to relieve yourself. You see, for all the poetry and grandeur we associate with the Middle Ages, the reality is that it was a world built without most of the comforts we take for granted. There were no faucets, no flushing toilets, no hand soap by the sink, and certainly no toilet paper waiting on a roll. So how did people manage? Let's take a moment to go back. Close your eyes, if you like, and imagine yourself waking up in a medieval stone house. The walls are thick, and the air is cold, colder than you're used to, because there's no insulation and no central heating. You can see your breath in the morning. There's no running water in your home, no shower, no bath, no plumbing of any kind. The closest thing to a bathroom might be a small wooden bench with a hole cut in it, placed above a pit. Or if you're lucky and you live in a castle, you might have access to something called a garderobe, which sounds fancier than it is. Essentially, it's a tiny room built into the stone wall with a vertical shaft leading down to an open pit outside the building. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't private, and it definitely wasn't odor-free. Now picture this. It's winter, the wind is howling. You wake up in the middle of the night and realize you need to go. There's no heated toilet seat, no hallway light. Just you, your slippers, maybe a candle, and a chamber pot, or if you're of a certain rank, the cold stone seat of a garderobe. Still with me? Good. Because here's the thing, the people still had to find ways to manage, and what they came up with was nothing short of creative. Before we dive into the solutions, some of which might make you chuckle or cringe, it's worth reflecting on something deeper. These weren't just minor inconveniences, they were daily realities. For people living centuries before us, surviving meant adapting, and adaptation meant accepting discomfort as normal. For example, if you were a peasant working in the fields, there was no designated bathroom break. Nature was your restroom, and whatever was around, be it leaves, straw, or snow, was your solution. People didn't talk about hygiene the way we do today. In fact, back then, many believed that too much bathing was bad for your health, a belief that unfortunately helped spread diseases more than prevent them. It's hard to imagine now. We live in a world where we can pick from 3 brands of toilet paper in one aisle and complain if the seat is too cold. But for people back then, even something as simple as keeping clean after relieving themselves was a challenge that required resourcefulness and often toughness. And perhaps that's something we've lost touch with in modern life. We're surrounded by convenience, but we forget the resilience of those who came before us. They didn't have ergonomic chairs, scented candles, or antibacterial wipes. They had grit. They had habits passed down through generations. They made do with what was available. History often focuses on kings and conquests, but real life happened in the quiet corners, behind the stable, outside the monastery, in the cramped alleyways of medieval towns. That's where you'll find the true stories of survival. Not just in how people fought or ruled, but in how they cleaned, cooked, endured, and cared for one another despite harsh conditions. So today, we begin not with a sword or a crown, but with a simple, almost silly question: how did people wipe? And through that question, we open a door to understanding the very texture of life in the Middle Ages, the routines, the discomforts, the creativity, and maybe, just maybe, we learn to appreciate what we have today a little more. So, let's take this journey together. We'll look at medieval toilets, hygiene customs, clever toilet paper alternatives, and what these strange habits tell us about being human across time. It may not be the prettiest side of history, but it's certainly one of the most honest, and sometimes that's exactly what makes a story worth telling. Let's stay in this medieval world for a while longer. You've already imagined plumbing, to wake up to a cold draft blowing through stone walls, and to face life's most basic tasks with courage and improvisation. Now, let's walk a little deeper into what medieval sanitation actually looked like. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't organized. But it was real, and it was daily life. Imagine you're inside a castle. It's a large one, owned by nobility, surrounded by high walls and grand towers. But despite the impressive architecture, this place doesn't smell like luxury. The truth is, those stone walls trap more than heat. They also trap odors. At the back of your chamber is a tiny stone nook, a small door leading to what's called a garderobe. The name sounds elegant, but it's not. The garderobe was a simple room carved into the wall, with a wooden seat set over a hole. That hole led directly outside the building, where your business would fall into a pit, or in some cases, right down the castle walls. And yes, gravity did the work. No flushing, no drainage system, just a straight drop. In warm weather, the smell could waft right back up. In cold weather, things might freeze, but the scent didn't go away, it just waited for spring. Now, think about the people responsible for maintaining those areas. Sometimes pits had to be cleaned by hand. Servants or hired laborers would descend into these cesspits, often without protective gear, scooping waste with buckets. The job was dangerous, dirty and disease-ridden, but someone had to do it. If you lived in the city, things weren't much better. Picture medieval Paris, or London, bustling, busy, full of markets, animals, bakers, blacksmiths, and waste. Lots of waste. There was no city-wide sewage system. People often threw their chamber pot contents directly into the street. It wasn't unusual to hear someone shout, "Gardez-vous," from an upper window, a warning that waste was about to be dumped below. And you imagine walking down a narrow cobblestone road, dodging waste, mud, and mystery puddles. Some streets had open gutters in the center, where everything flowed: human waste, animal droppings, rotten food, rainwater, and more. And it all flowed toward the rivers, which were also used for drinking, cooking, and washing. Let that sink in for a moment. Public bathhouses existed, especially in earlier centuries, but they gradually fell out of favor. Many people came to believe that bathing could actually make you sick, because they thought disease entered the body through open pores. Ironically, the lack of cleanliness led to more illness, not less. In the countryside, things were simpler but not necessarily cleaner. Most people used outdoor latrines, holes dug in the ground with a wooden structure built above. These outhouses were usually shared by entire families, sometimes even neighbors, and they weren't cleaned regularly. Just imagine the build-up over time. For poorer families, there were no designated outhouses. People simply went behind trees, near streams, or in the fields, often with little to no privacy. It was part of life. There were no boundaries, no embarrassment, just necessity. Now, let's shift our focus back to cities for a moment. In wealthier urban homes, there were some attempts at sanitation innovation. A few buildings had vertical shafts similar to the castle, garderobes that emptied into cesspits or moats. Some even had early versions of septic tanks. Though they were primitive and rarely maintained, they filled up quickly and overflowed during rainstorms, causing foul floods in the streets. The smell in medieval towns was something people simply had to live with. Hygiene wasn't seen as a personal duty, but rather a matter of survival. People burned herbs and incense to mask the odors. They carried small bags of dried flowers called pomanders to sniff when the air grew thick. Wealthy ladies might dab perfumes onto their handkerchiefs. Monks would burn rosemary or sage during Mass, not just for spiritual reasons but to clear the air. What's fascinating is that people didn't ignore the smells. They were very aware of them. They just didn't understand germs or how disease was spread. The idea of bacteria wouldn't come until centuries later, but their instincts weren't entirely wrong. Many believed that bad smells could make you sick. In a way, they were right, only they didn't know that it wasn't the scent itself, but the source of the scent that carried disease. And then there were the animals. In medieval life, animals were everywhere: chickens in courtyards, horses on the streets, dogs in kitchens, pigs rooting through trash, their waste mixed with human waste, creating a hazardous slushy blend that coated the roads and seeped into daily life. City officials tried at times to regulate the mess. There were laws against dumping waste in the streets. People were fined for throwing filth out their windows, but enforcement was inconsistent and infrastructure was limited. The result, a city that looked a swamp up close, and yet people adapted. Children played in alleyways, vendors set up shop near open gutters, families found ways to live, love, eat, and celebrate, despite the mess. That's the astonishing part of this chapter in history. People endured. They weren't dainty or fragile. They were tough, resourceful, and shockingly resilient. They found ways to work with their environment, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And while their solutions may seem unpleasant to us now, they were ingenious for the time. The garderobes, the public cesspits, the early septic systems, all were steps toward the sanitation we enjoy today. So the next time you walk into a clean bathroom, turn on a tap, or flush a toilet, take a second to remember how far we've come. Because the road to cleanliness wasn't paved in porcelain and scented soap, it was carved through stone walls, muddy streets, and centuries of trial and error. And that's something worth appreciating. So far, we've taken you into the cold stone castles, down the winding alleys of medieval cities, and into the makeshift privies of farmers and monks. You've seen just how little the Middle Ages offered in terms of sanitation, plumbing, and privacy. But now, let's turn to a question that's just as important, and perhaps even more personal. When there was no toilet paper, what did people use instead? It's one of those little details of life we don't think about until we're forced to. In modern times, we're spoiled by softness, double-ply, scented, quilted rolls. A simple trip to the grocery store gives us options we didn't know we needed, but imagine for just a moment that all of it disappeared. What would you do? For the average medieval person, the answer was simple. Whatever was around. Let's start with the countryside. If you were a peasant working the fields, living in a small hut with no supplies beyond what nature gave you, you had to get creative. One of the most common solutions. Leaves, broad, soft leaves were ideal if they were in season, but nature doesn't always cooperate. When leaves weren't available, people turned to hay, straw, or even moss. Moss was especially popular in northern regions. It was soft, absorbent, and widely available in the forests. In fact, it became the go-to material for much of the peasant population. You could gather it yourself and keep a small bundle nearby for personal use. But moss came with its own problems. It needed to be dry, it needed to be clean, and even then, it could cause irritation or rashes if used too often. Some plants were even toxic if handled the wrong way, so what seemed soft and innocent could quickly turn into an itchy disaster. In drier regions where moss didn't grow, other options took its place. People might use pieces of cloth if they could spare them. These were usually scraps, not finely woven. Linen, just whatever old rags were on hand. The cloth would be washed and reused until it fell apart. But if you didn't have cloth, if there were no leaves, no moss, no straw, then things got rough, literally. One common method in coastal areas was to use shells. Yes, you heard that right. Shells from clams, mussels, or even larger mollusks were sometimes used to scrape clean. It sounds shocking to us today, and perhaps even dangerous, but back then it was part of life. People would select the smoothest, least sharp shells and learn to use them carefully. Sometime they didn't get it right. Small cuts, infections, and even serious wounds could result from using shells improperly. But again, necessity overruled comfort. When you're dealing with the harsh conditions of daily survival, soft toilet paper just isn't on the priority list. In some parts of Europe, people also used smooth wooden spatulas, polished and rounded at the end. These tools were designed to be wiped clean and reused. Think of it like a reusable toilet wand. Not pleasant, but effective and surprisingly common. And then in truly desperate moments, when nothing else was available, people relied on what they always had, their hands. Yes, it's true. In many cultures, especially among the poor or during travel, the left hand became the designated cleaning hand. That's why even today in parts of the world, the left hand is considered impolite for greetings, eating, or handing someone a gift. The association with uncleanliness runs deep, and it comes straight from centuries of this practical, if unpleasant, habit. Now, before we judge too quickly, it's important to remember this. These people weren't dirty or foolish. They were doing the best they could with what they had, and in many ways their methods laid the groundwork for modern sanitation. Interestingly, the wealthy had better options. If you were a nobleman or a monk living in a well-resourced monastery, you might have access to linen cloths, soft, durable, and washable. These were kept in baskets and used exclusively by the elite. After use, by servants or launderers, dried in the sun and folded for the next day. Still, even for the wealthy, hygiene wasn't always perfect. The cloths weren't always properly cleaned. They might be used by multiple people before being replaced. And while it beat using moss or shells, it wasn't exactly the luxury we might imagine today. There's also the fascinating story of the Romans, whose system was ahead of its time. In public toilets, they used a sponge attached to a stick called a tersorium. The sponge would be dipped in salt water or vinegar to cleanse it between uses, but the catch, it was shared, one sponge, many people. You might be cringing, and rightfully so. It wasn't sanitary by today's standards, but it was a real solution, built on the knowledge and tools they had. And for centuries, it worked. After the fall of the Roman Empire, though, many of these innovations disappeared. The sponge on a stick vanished and Europe returned to more basic, nature-based methods. The Middle Ages became a time of survival, not innovation. So why does this matter? Because when we understand what people used instead of toilet paper, we see something profound: resilience. They didn't have modern science, they didn't have supermarkets, but they had resourcefulness, tradition, and shared knowledge. They passed down what worked, they avoided what didn't, they lived with discomfort and made peace with it. And maybe that's something we can learn from today. In a world where we panic at the thought of empty shelves, where we expect softness and convenience in every corner of life, it's worth remembering that our ancestors did just fine with moss, cloth, and yes, even shells. So next time you reach for a roll of toilet paper, take a moment to appreciate it. It's not just paper, it's the result of centuries of trial, error, and human creativity. And when you look back through history, sometimes it's these small details, the ones we never talk about, that tell us the most about what it really means to be human. By now, we've seen how medieval people used everything from moss to seashells to manage their daily hygiene. But sanitation in the Middle Ages wasn't just about what was available, it was also deeply tied to social class and tradition. Just like today, not everyone had access to the same level of comfort, and what you used or didn't use often said a lot about who you were. Let's start at the top of the ladder. The nobility. If you were born into wealth during the Middle Ages, hygiene was still a challenge, but at least you had a few more options. Nobles lived in castles or large manors with dedicated spaces for relieving oneself. These weren't what? Wed. Whole bathrooms, of course, but rather garderobes, stone-built closets hanging over pits or even over open moats. And when it came to cleaning, nobles had the luxury of linen cloths. These were soft, reusable, and often laundered by servants. They weren't exactly disposable. Each cloth would be used multiple times and washed carefully with water, sometimes scented with herbs or vinegar. This might sound primitive to us, but compared to the peasant using straw or their bare hand, it was a mark of status. In fact, many monasteries where monks lived quiet and structured lives also used linen cloths. Hygiene and ritual cleanliness were deeply connected in monastic life, especially for certain religious orders that valued purity as part of their spiritual practice. But not all nobles had it easy. Even kings and queens weren't immune to the foul odors drifting through stone corridors. When castles lacked proper drainage, the stench from latrine pits could rise into bedrooms, kitchens, or gathering halls. To mask this, nobles often burned herbs, wore perfumed pouches, and rubbed fragrant oils on their skin, not so much to stay clean, but to smell clean. You may be surprised to hear that in the Middle Ages, how you smelled was almost more important than whether you were actually clean. Scent was a sign of refinement, of wealth, of good taste. If you could afford perfume, you were someone of standing. If you smelled like the streets, well, people assumed you belonged there. And yet, while wealth gave you better tools, it didn't protect you from everything. Even in monasteries and palaces, the spread of disease was rampant. Linen cloths could still harbor bacteria. Shared garderobes still exposed users to unsanitary conditions. And while perfumes could cover bad smells, they couldn't cover up infection. Now let's travel down the social ladder to the working poor, the peasants, the farmers, the people who made up the majority of medieval society. These were the people who lived by daylight and survived by grit. Their homes were small, sometimes shared with animals. Their water came from rivers or shared wells. Their waste was buried, tossed, or left to the elements. There was no linen for them, no servants to wash cloths. Their choices were dictated by what to live with discomfort as a fact of life. In some cultures, especially in warmer climates, the left hand became the designated hand for cleaning. That's why even to this day, in parts of the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa, it's considered rude to greet someone with your left hand. That custom isn't just about politeness, it's about centuries, old hygiene practices that helped people avoid sickness. This divide between right and left, between clean and unclean, wasn't just about germs. It became symbolic. The right hand was for eating, sharing, giving. The left hand was for everything else. Over time, this split became a cultural boundary, separating what was public from what was private, and what was respectable from what was not. These subtle traditions still shape our world today, even if we no longer think about them. In medieval Japan, for instance, there were also class-based differences. In hygiene, samurai warriors had access to towels and bathhouses. Commoners used what they could. And in Islamic societies, ablution, ritual washing was and remains a religious obligation, closely tied to spiritual cleanliness. In these cultures, water was sacred, and even in the desert, people found ways to stay clean through careful, methodical washing. Back in medieval Europe, however, things were more uneven. The poor relied on rivers and lakes. In the winter, those rivers froze, and when even snow was scarce, people had to make impossible choices. Hygiene wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be dangerous. Yet through it all, communities adapted, and class differences shaped how. A wealthy home might have a garderobe with fresh herbs hanging by the window. A peasant's home might have a bundle of dry moss kept behind a curtain, but both were solving the same problem, just with different tools. And let's not forget about the role of women in all this. Women were often the keepers of cleanliness in the household. They were the ones who taught children how to use the family latrine. They cleaned the cloths. They managed the bath water. In noble houses, they organized perfuming rituals and kept linen supplies in order. In poor homes, they stitched together rag wipes from old garments. And yet, women had even fewer public spaces for sanitation. In many cities, men used public bathhouses or latrines. Women often had to wait, hold it in, or rely on privacy that didn't exist. Modesty and hygiene were always in tension. There's something deeply human about this part of history. We often separate ourselves from the past, thinking people back then were somehow dirtier, rougher, less civilized. But that's not entirely fair. They weren't careless. They were doing the best they could, bound by the resources they had and the knowledge available to them. And what's remarkable is that many of the customs they formed, the left-hand taboo, the use of scent, the association between class and cleanliness, still echo through time. So the next time you shake someone's hand, light a scented candle, or complain that the restroom is too small, just remember, we've come a long way, but we're still shaped by the same needs. Hygiene isn't just about being clean, it's about dignity, about identity, and about the small rituals that connect us, not only to each other but to everyone who came before. By now you've walked the stone corridors of medieval castles. You've stepped through the muddy streets of medieval cities. You've crouched beside forest streams with bundles of moss, felt the sting of cold wind through your cloak, and imagined the awkward discomfort of using a seashell or wooden spatula just to stay clean. And perhaps in some strange way, you've come to see that history isn't just about grand events, it's about small moments. Moments that make us human, because at the heart of all this, beyond the castles and cloisters, beyond kings and peasants, is a simple truth. Everyone, no matter their station, had to deal with the same basic needs. And isn't that something? We spend so much of our lives thinking about the big things, success, legacy, who we were and what we left behind. But it's the small things, like having a private place to go, something clean to use, a fresh towel, a bar of soap, that quietly define the rhythm of our days. Imagine living in a world where you didn't have those, where you had to wait for winter snow just to feel somewhat clean, where a bad leaf or a broken pot could lead to infection, where odor was so common that you had to carry a pouch of herbs just to breathe comfortably. And then imagine doing all of that without complaint, because you didn't know any other way. That was reality for millions of people for hundreds of years. They didn't have hand sanitizer. They didn't have two-ply softness, but they had resourcefulness, they had courage, and they had community. And people taught each other what worked. They passed down habits, customs, and knowledge the same way we pass down recipes. There's a kind of strength in that, a quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need fanfare or applause. And perhaps, if we pause to think about it, we'll realize that we carry some of that same strength within us even now. After all, many of you watching have lived through your own difficult chapters. You remember life before everything came in plastic packaging. You remember using cloth instead of disposable towels. You remember times when indoor plumbing wasn't a given. You've seen the world change, and you've adapted with it. In that way, you have more in common with your medieval ancestors than you might think. But what separates us most today isn't the materials or the tools. It's the luxury of choice. We can choose softness. We can choose warmth. We can choose privacy, dignity, and comfort, because someone somewhere once didn't have that choice, and they endured. And maybe that's the gift of history. It doesn't just inform us, it grounds us. It reminds us that progress isn't about feeling superior, it's about feeling grateful. And it's about never taking the simple things for granted again. Things like running water, like clean hands, like a roll of toilet paper within reach. So today, as we close this little journey through the messier side of the Middle Ages, I invite you to pause for a moment, not to laugh or cringe, but to appreciate. Appreciate the people who came before us, not for their inventions, but for their resilience. They didn't write history books, but they lived it. They didn't win wars, but they kept their families fed, clean, and safe. And they didn't have modern medicine, but they gave us the foundation we build on today. Their world was hard, but it was theirs, and their solutions, strange as they may seem, were the seeds of the systems we now depend on. So next time you walk into your bathroom, take a second to look around. Notice the warmth, the light, the plumbing, the scent, the privacy. Then smile. Because you're living in the future they never imagined, and if someone ever tells you history is boring, remind them that history is full of people who were just like us. They had to improvise, endure, adapt and laugh, too, when things got absurd. Because if there's one thing that's universal, it's this: we all go. And now I leave you with a light-hearted question. If you had to choose cleaning with moss or sharing a vinegar soak sponge, what would you pick? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story gave you a smile, a new perspective, or simply something to think about, don't forget to give this video a like and share it with someone who enjoys a good, thoughtful tale. Until next time, take care of yourself and your bathroom. When we think of the Middle Ages, a certain kind of image usually comes to mind: gallant knights on horseback, towering stone castles, royal banquets under flickering candlelight, and queens in gowns that sweep across the floor. Hollywood has done a great job painting the period as romantic, noble, even magical, but for all the pageantry we associate with the medieval world, we rarely stop to ask a more